In 2001, I was stationed in Yosemite National Park, California. My name is Michael Brooks, but my colleagues affectionately called me Mountain Goat for my ability to traverse challenging terrains effortlessly. I've always been passionate about my job, but that summer was different. It changed everything. It started like any typical season with campers, hikers, and occasionally groups of college kids thinking they could conquer the wilderness with just a six-pack and a map. I was coming off a tough week of guiding inexperienced teens out of the forest when an emergency call came in on a Thursday afternoon. Two backpackers, Ethan and Daniel, were reported missing. They hadn't returned to their car at the trailhead after 3 days without any communication. It's not unusual for people to go missing. Usually they turn up sunburned, dehydrated, and sheepish. However, this time the report included mentions of strange animal sounds in the area, which is why they requested an experienced ranger. I was paired with Chris, a junior ranger who was just 2 months into the job. Chris had the overconfident swagger of someone who believed the scariest thing in the woods was a bear. A good kid, but naive. As we prepared our gear, a sense of unease gripped me. Something about this call was different. The mention of unusual animal sounds kept playing back in my mind. Over my years as a ranger, I'd encountered various wildlife, but the dispatcher's tone suggested something out of the ordinary. "Ready for this, Mountain Goat?" Chris asked with a grin, shouldering his pack. I nodded, double-checking my emergency kit. Remember, the forest doesn't care how prepared you think you are. Stay alert. As we set off, the sun was already sinking behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the trail. The forest seemed to close in around us, the familiar weight of the wilderness pressing down. But there was an additional, indefinable tension in the air. The trail wasn't tough, well-trodden, and popular among backpackers. It led deep into the forest, down toward a riverbed before looping back up to higher ground. I expected to find Ethan and Daniel camping off the trail, maybe stuck somewhere or injured. Our radios crackled with static, typical for the remote terrain. The dense pines loomed over us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers as dusk approached and the forest shifted, shadows deepening and familiar sounds distorting. Ever get spooked out here, Michael? Chris's earlier confidence seemed to wane. I considered my response carefully. The forest demands respect. It's not about getting spooked, it's about staying aware. Just then, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond our flashlight beams. Chris jumped, and I felt my own pulse quicken. It was probably just a deer or a raccoon, but in that moment, it felt like something more. We pressed on, our flashlights carving a path through the growing darkness. The night sounds of the forest surrounded us. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But there was something else, too, a sound I couldn't quite identify. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shiver down my spine. Around midnight, we came upon the first real sign of trouble. A torn-up campsite appeared in the glow of our flashlights. The tents were shredded, and there was a cooking pot still half full of burnt beans tipped over next to the extinguished campfire. There was no sign of Ethan or Daniel. Chris raised an eyebrow, gesturing to the mess. "Bear!" I shook my head, examining the scene closely. Bears don't just wreck a camp without leaving tracks or digging through food. There were no claw marks on the trees, no fur left behind. I squatted near the remains of a sleeping bag. The fabric was torn, but not in a way that suggested animal claws. It looked like it had been ripped apart by something with brute strength. Not great. I could feel Chris tense up beside me. "What do you think did this?" I didn't answer immediately, and that silence was enough to spook him. We kept moving, the shadows between the trees seeming to stretch and warp in our flashlight beams. That's when I heard it, just the faintest shuffle of leaves, like something moving lightly through the underbrush. Chris didn't hear it at first, but I did, a rustling that didn't quite fit with the stillness of the forest. I motioned for him to stop. We waited, our breath misting in the cool night air. The sound came again, closer this time. I didn't like it. I drew my knife, not because I thought it would do much, but because it was better than nothing. Chris gave me a look, half concerned, half confused, but he didn't ask questions. Smart move. The noise stopped, leaving us in silence once again, but the feeling of being watched, of something out there in the darkness did not fade. We followed the riverbank for a while, our flashlights illuminating the damp, soft ground, perfect for tracking. Several human prints led toward the water, but there was something else, something bigger. I crouched down to examine the tracks closely. They were wide, larger than a human foot, but in the dim light, I couldn't make out the exact shape. It wasn't any animal I was familiar with, and that realization sent a chill through me. Chris bent down, running his hand over the tracks. "What the hell is that?" I didn't answer. The truth was, I didn't know, and that uncertainty was more frightening than any bear or mountain lion. We kept moving, though every step felt heavier, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. The air grew thicker, more oppressive as we pushed through the dense underbrush. I'm not a superstitious man, but there was something wrong with this part of the forest. It felt alien, as though we weren't supposed to be there. I didn't say anything to Chris, but I could tell by the way he kept glancing around that he felt it too. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. The usual nighttime sounds were absent. It was as if the whole area was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As we ventured deeper, the tracks became more frequent. Whatever had made them was moving with purpose, following the same path we were on. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a large bear or even a moose, but deep down, I knew it was something else entirely. The beam of my flashlight caught something reflective up ahead. As we approached, my stomach dropped. It was a backpack, torn and muddy, its contents strewn across the forest floor. Next to it lay a broken camera, its lens cracked and useless. Chris picked up a torn piece of paper, a map of the area. "You think it's theirs?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded grimly. "Has to be. We're on the right track." But I didn't finish the sentence. We both knew what it meant. Whatever had happened to Ethan and Daniel, it wasn't good. As if to confirm our worst fears, a sound echoed through the trees. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a roar. It was something in between, something that didn't belong in these woods. Something that made every instinct in my body scream to run. But we couldn't. We had a job to do, and 2 missing hikers to find, even if every step forward felt like we were walking into a trap. It wasn't long before we found the bodies. Ethan and Daniel, or what was left of them, were sprawled near a clearing. They were torn apart, and I mean that literally. Their limbs were scattered, ripped from their torsos, and their faces were almost unrecognizable. I've seen animal attacks before. I've seen the aftermath of a bear or a mountain lion attack, but this was different. This was savage, but not in the way a wild animal kills to eat. This was intentional, almost methodical. Chris turned pale, and for a second, I thought he might vomit. He muttered something under his breath about leaving, but I ignored him. My focus was on something else, on the tracks leading away from the bodies. Whatever did this had walked away on 2 legs. I took out my radio to call it in, but there was only static. Of course, because why would anything work when you need it the most? "We have to go," I told Chris, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "We need to report this and get a full team out here." That's when we heard it. Something moving through the trees, slow, deliberate, and coming closer. It was the same sound I'd heard earlier, but louder now, heavier, as if whatever it was didn't care that we knew it was there. Chris started backing up, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not the kind of fear you get when a bear shows up, but the kind that sinks into your bones because you know you're dealing with something you don't understand. We didn't wait to see what it was. We ran. Now, I've run from bears before. I've had to scramble up rocks to avoid mountain lions. But this was different. It felt like the forest itself was pushing us back, urging us to get the hell out. Every tree looked like it was leaning in, narrowing the path, making it harder to escape. Chris stumbled over a root, nearly face-planting into the dirt. I grabbed him by the arm and yanked him back up, but I could hear it now. Something breathing heavy, slow breaths, like they were deliberate, calculated. It wasn't chasing us, but it wasn't far behind either. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. I don't even know how to describe the thing. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, maybe more. Its skin was pale, stretched over muscle and bone in a way that didn't seem right. I couldn't see a face clearly, just a vague shape, But the way it moved, slow and deliberate, wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It had the stance of a man, but the movements of something predatory, like it was stalking us. Chris saw it too, and that was all it took for him to start panicking. He let out a shout, a panicked yell that echoed through the trees. Big mistake. The thing stopped, its head snapping toward us, and then it moved fast. Chris ran, screaming something about getting out, about dying here, but I barely heard him. My adrenaline kicked in, my focus narrowed. I didn't look back again, didn't want to. All I could do was run, one foot in front of the other, hoping like hell that whatever was behind us wouldn't catch up. The path ahead split, and without thinking, I grabbed Chris by the arm and pulled him down the left trail. It led deeper into the forest toward the cliffs near the river. I could hear the thing behind us, crashing through the underbrush like it didn't care who or what was in its way. It was getting closer. I could feel it. Then I saw the cliff's edge ahead of us, and I knew we were out of options. Chris was panting hard, stumbling beside me, his eyes wild with fear. I didn't stop. I didn't give him a chance to think. I pushed him toward the cliff. We slid down the rocky slope, dirt and gravel tearing at my hands and knees. I heard Chris hit the bottom with a grunt, but I didn't check to see if he was okay. I just scrambled to my feet, pulling him up as the thing came to a halt at the top of the cliff, staring down at us. It didn't move for a moment. I thought we were safe, that maybe it wouldn't follow us down the steep incline. But then, with slow, deliberate movements, it began climbing down. Its long arms reached for the rocks, like it had done this 100 times before. Chris was shaking, his breath coming in short gasps. He wanted to run. I could see it in his eyes, but I grabbed his arm, forcing him to stay still. If we ran now, we wouldn't make it. The thing reached the bottom of the cliff. Its eyes, or whatever passed for eyes, locked onto us. It didn't roar or growl, didn't make any sound at all. It just moved toward us, slow, methodical, like it knew we had nowhere left to go. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was adrenaline, maybe desperation, but I pulled the flare gun from my pack. I only had one shot, but it was better than nothing. Chris was too scared to do anything but stare as I raised the flare gun, aiming at the thing's chest. I pulled the trigger. The flare shot out, bright and burning, hitting the creature square in the chest. For a second, it staggered back, its body jerking as if in surprise. Then it let out a sound, a deep, guttural noise that vibrated through my bones. It wasn't a sound of pain, but of anger. The thing didn't die. It didn't even fall, but it stopped. It looked at me, then at Chris, and then without warning, it turned and walked back into the trees. I don't know why it left us. Maybe the flare hurt it. Maybe it didn't see us as worth the effort anymore. But whatever the reason, it was gone, disappearing into the forest as silently as it had appeared. We didn't stick around to find out why. When we finally made it back to the trailhead, I called it in. Ethan and Daniel were dead. That much was clear. As for what killed them, I didn't have an explanation. I filed the report, described the bodies, but I didn't mention the thing we saw. The official investigation concluded it was a bear attack. The Forest Service increased patrols, put up more warning signs about wildlife, but I knew the truth. Whatever killed those men wasn't any bear I'd ever seen. Chris quit shortly after. Can't say I blame him. He was young, had his whole life ahead of him. No need to stick around in a job that showed him the darker side of nature. As for me, I'm still here, still working the same trails, but I stay away from that part of the forest now. Some places you just don't go, and whatever that thing was, it's still out there. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into research. I pored over old legends, spoke to local tribal elders, trying to find any mention of something that matched what we saw. Most of what I found was just campfire stories, tales to scare kids into staying close to home. But there was one story that stuck with me, an old Ute legend about a spirit that protected the forest. It was said to punish those who disrespected the land, who took more than they needed. The description was vague, but mentioned a tall, pale figure that moved silently through the trees. I'm not saying that's what we saw. I'm a man of science, after all. But after what happened that night, I'm not so quick to dismiss the old stories anymore. Months passed, and life in the forest returned to normal, or as normal as it could be when you've seen something you can't explain. I kept my head down, did my job, tried to forget, but then the reports started coming in again. Hikers going missing, strange sounds in the night, torn up campsites with no signs of animal involvement. I knew I had to go back, had to face whatever was out there. This time, I went alone, couldn't risk anyone else's life, not after what happened to Chris. The trail seemed different now, darker somehow. Every shadow held a potential threat. Every rustle in the undergrowth made my heart race. But I pressed on, driven by a need to understand, to confront the thing that had haunted my nightmares for months. As night fell, I reached the clearing where we'd found the bodies. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my boots. Then I saw it, standing at the edge of the clearing, its pale form almost glowing in the moonlight. It was exactly as I remembered, tall, inhuman, with limbs that were just a bit too long. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I could feel its gaze boring into me, searching for something. Then, slowly, it raised one long arm and pointed deeper into the forest. I don't know why, but I followed. It led me through the trees, moving with that same eerie grace I remembered. We walked for what felt like hours, until we reached a part of the forest I'd never seen before. The trees here were ancient, their trunks wider than any I'd ever seen, the ground carpeted with moss, so thick it muffled my footsteps. And there, in the center of it all, was an ancient, gnarled tree, its bark carved with intricate symbols, similar to those I'd seen in the abandoned cabin. The creature gestured toward the tree. As I approached, I felt a strange connection, like the forest was trying to communicate. The symbols began to glow faintly, and I understood. This was the heart of the forest, and the creature was its guardian. I realized the attacks weren't random. They were a defense against those who threatened the forest's balance. The guardian wasn't evil, just protective. I faced a decision: reveal the truth and risk exploitation of the forest, or keep the secret and become its protector alongside the guardian. I chose to protect. Over time, I learned to communicate with the guardian and the forest itself. We worked together to maintain balance, steering people away from sacred areas and educating visitors about respecting nature. Years passed, the forest thrived under our care, and sightings of the guardian became rare, more legend than threat. As I near retirement, I prepare to pass on my role. The forest has chosen its next protector. The cycle continues. The ancient pact between humans and nature, preserved for another generation. My name is Tom Harris. I've been a park ranger for 20 years, and if there's one thing I've learned in that time, it's that the wilderness has rules, unspoken, immutable rules. You respect the land, and usually, it'll respect you back. But sometimes you find something out there that doesn't belong. Something that breaks those rules. That's what happened on my last patrol with Molly Price. Molly was fresh out of training, too young and too full of fire for a job like this. She reminded me too much of my daughter, Cassie, stubborn, fearless, and in her mind invincible. When you're young, you don't know that some things are better left undiscovered. The call came in late that afternoon. 2 missing hikers, Evan Sanders and Josh Carter. Friends from out of town who'd set up camp near Devil's Ridge 3 days earlier. They hadn't returned, and no one had heard from them. Their families were worried sick. "We'll find them," Molly said, adjusting her pack with a confidence I didn't share. The deeper we hiked into the backcountry, the quieter the forest became. No bird song, no rustling branches, just silence. I kept my hand near my belt, where my flare gun sat holstered. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, but it didn't feel like enough. By the time we found their camp, the sun had dipped low, painting the sky a sickly orange. What was left of the camp wasn't much: a shredded tent, backpacks strewn across the clearing, and the smell of rot hanging thick in the still air. And then we saw them. Evan and Josh, or what was left of them, were scattered across the clearing. A severed hand, the wrist ragged as though it had been ripped clean off, lay near the fire pit. Further out, a leg bent unnaturally, boots still laced tightly. Ahead, Josh's head sat propped against a rock, his eyes wide open in frozen terror. Molly gasped, stumbling back. "Oh my God, Oh my God! I swallowed hard, forcing down the bile, rising in my throat. Blood splattered the ground in great arcs, as though something had tossed the bodies around for sport. I'd seen animal attacks before, bears, mountain lions, but this was different. Animals don't play with their food. This wasn't a bear, I muttered under my breath. And that's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl came from the tree line, vibrating in my chest. Slowly, I turned my head. The shadows between the trees shifted and outstepped it. At first glance, it looked like a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what might have once been clothes. But its proportions were wrong. Its arms were too long, the hands ending in claws. Patches of dark fur covered its pale, human-like skin. Its face was stretched, its mouth elongated into a snout filled with jagged teeth, and its eyes glowed faintly yellow, like a predator caught in headlights. The creature let out a sound, a mix of a snarl and a low, wet breath that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Tom, Molly's voice trembled. The creature stepped forward. "Don't move," I whispered. "Whatever you do, don't." But before I could finish, Molly bolted. She turned and ran blindly into the woods, her footsteps pounding against the earth. "Molly!" "No!" I shouted, but it was too late. The creature's head snapped in her direction, and with an almost liquid movement, it bounded after her, vanishing into the darkness. I didn't think, I just ran. I sprinted after Molly, crashing through branches and underbrush, my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn back, to hide. But I couldn't leave her out here. If she got lost, if it caught her... The sound of something moving fast cut through the forest like a freight train barreling through the trees. I heard Molly ahead of me, her breath sharp and ragged. I pushed harder, forcing my legs to move faster than they ever had. "Molly! This way!" I yelled. I saw her then, stumbling over roots, her face streaked with tears and dirt. I grabbed her arm, yanking her forward just as something crashed into the trees behind us. I didn't dare look back. The creature was close. I could hear its breath, feel the earth shake under its weight. Suddenly, there was a crack. A branch, huge and heavy, fell from above, slamming into the ground between us and the creature. Molly screamed, and I pulled her with me as we staggered into a narrow gully, hidden beneath an overhang of rock. We collapsed in the mud, gasping for air. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from above, we heard it, a low growl, the sound of claws scraping against stone. The creature was still there, pacing just beyond our hiding spot. I gripped Molly's hand tightly, willing her not to make a sound. After what felt like hours, the growling stopped. The forest grew silent once more. We didn't speak as we hiked back to the ranger station. Molly kept close to me, flinching at every sound, every movement in the shadows. When we reported what we'd found, no one believed us. "It was a bear," they said. "A big one. You were spooked, that's all." Molly didn't argue. She didn't say a word. She quit the next day, but I couldn't let it go. I knew what I'd seen. I started digging, asking questions, searching through old records, old newspaper clippings. What I found sent chills down my spine. There had been reports, other reports of something in the woods. Stories of missing hikers, strange sightings, and bodies torn apart, dating back over 100 years. The locals whispered about the skinwalker or the wild man of Bear Creek, a creature caught somewhere between man and beast. A werewolf, some said. I didn't believe in that sort of thing, at least not until I saw it with my own eyes. I returned to Devil's Ridge a month later. This time, I was prepared. I brought my rifle, loaded with silver-tipped bullets I'd bought from a hunter who claimed they were for things that shouldn't be. I carried flares, a knife, and a small recorder, proof if I needed it. The forest was waiting for me. It didn't take long to find it. The creature stepped out of the shadows, its yellow eyes locking onto mine. It snarled, lips pulling back to reveal those jagged teeth. I raised my rifle, my hand steady despite the pounding of my heart. "I know what you are," I said. It lunged. I fired. The silver round struck it in the chest, and the creature let out a howl that echoed through the trees. It staggered, clawing at the wound, dark blood spilling onto the ground. But it didn't fall. It came at me again, slower this time, its movements jerky and unnatural. I fired twice more, one shot hitting its shoulder, the other burying deep into its stomach. The creature let out a final, choked snarl before collapsing onto the forest floor. I approached cautiously, rifle still raised. Up close, it looked almost human, its features twisted and grotesque, but undeniably manlike beneath the fur and claws. The eyes, though dim, were still watching me, as if trying to remember who it once was. And then it went still. I didn't report the creature. Who would believe me? The official story said a rogue bear had been put down, and the case of the missing hikers was closed. But I know the truth. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I think I hear it. Heavy footsteps in the distance, a low growl just beyond the edge of the light. Maybe it's my imagination, or maybe there's more of them out there waiting. The forest is vast, and we don't know half of what's hiding in its shadows. And maybe it's better that way. My name's Jack Thornton, and I've been a park ranger for over 15 years. There's not much I haven't seen out in the wilderness. Bears, coyotes, poachers, drunk hikers stumbling off trails. You name it. But what I encountered that night in Pine Hollow, well, I still don't have the words to explain it properly. All I know is that it's changed the way I look at the woods forever. Pine Hollow National Park isn't the kind of place that shows up on glossy travel magazines. It's remote. Thousands of acres of dense, untouched forest crisscrossed with a few forgotten trails and abandoned logging roads. Most visitors come for the quiet. Photographers, loners, people looking to disappear for a while. The kind of people who don't want to be found. This was a late September night, right after the first cold snap of the season. The air had that sharp, earthy smell you only get in the fall, when the leaves start to turn and decay. I was on patrol, standard check of the trails and campsites, when I got a call from dispatch. "Jack, we got a report of strange noises near Pine Hollow Ridge. Could you check it out?" I frowned. Pine Hollow Ridge wasn't a place we got a lot of visitors. It was hard to get to, 4 miles up a forgotten trail that hadn't been properly maintained in years. But noises? That was unusual. What kind of noises? I asked, already tightening my pack straps. Caller didn't say. Sounded panicked. Couldn't get much out of them before the line dropped. Local number, though. Great. I muttered. I'll check it out. Probably some idiot playing pranks. I loaded up my gear, flashlight, first aid kit, radio, and grabbed the rifle from the truck. I didn't think I'd need it, but the woods have a way of surprising you when you're unprepared. The hike up to Pine Hollow Ridge was rough. The trail was overgrown, branches slapping against my shoulders as I walked. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. You don't really notice the noise of the woods, the birds, the crickets, the wind, until it's gone. By the time I reached the ridge, there wasn't a sound. Not a single bird call or rustle. Just dead, suffocating silence. I've been in forests during storms, fires, and blizzards. I've seen wildlife scatter in fear. But this was something else. It felt wrong, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I flicked on my flashlight and scanned the clearing ahead. There were signs someone had been there recently. A fire pit, half-burned wood, and an overturned backpack spilling its contents onto the ground. Clothes, a water bottle, a shoe. Just one. That's when I saw the blood. It wasn't much at first, just a smear on the dirt near the backpack. But as I stepped closer, my beam caught more of it. Dark streaks trailing into the trees, as though something, or someone, had been dragged. I crouched near the fire pit, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding small and weak against the vast emptiness. "Anyone out here?" No answer. The blood trail pulled at me, an unspoken urge to follow, like a tug at the back of my mind. I didn't want to go into those woods, but something or someone was out there, and they might still be alive. I gripped the rifle tighter and followed the blood. The further I went, the worse it got. The streaks turned into splatters, then pools. Branches were broken and bent, the bark gouged with deep claw marks. I'd seen bear territory before. This wasn't it. Whatever made these marks didn't walk on 4 legs. The silence grew heavier as I moved. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the dark, illuminating flashes of red against the leaves and roots. And then I saw it, a shape, crouched just ahead, half hidden behind a fallen tree. My heart stopped. "Hey," I shouted, raising the light. "Are you okay?" The figure shifted. At first, I thought it was a person, a hiker who'd been injured. Maybe, but as the beam hit it fully, I realized how wrong I was. It was tall, far too tall to be human, hunched over like it was too big for its own skin. Its limbs were long and skeletal, joints bending the wrong way. The thing's head was what froze me in place. It was elongated, with a gaping maw that split its face like an open wound. Its skin looked gray and stretched, too tight across its bones. And its eyes were black pits, glistening wetly as they turned toward me. For a moment, neither of us moved. I stood there, frozen in place, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The creature tilted its head, almost curiously, as though it was trying to decide what I was. And then it moved. The thing let out a sound, low and rattling, like something breathing through broken glass, and lunged. I fired the rifle without thinking, the shot echoing like thunder through the empty woods. The creature stopped mid-stride, letting out a shriek that made my ears ring, and then it vanished. One moment it was there, the next it melted back into the darkness like smoke. I stood there, panting, my rifle still raised. My flashlight flickered. The forest was silent again. I don't remember much of the hike back. It's a blur of panic and adrenaline, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I stumbled through the underbrush. Every now and then, I'd hear it, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves just out of sight. It was following me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, a heavy presence just beyond the edge of the light. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I slammed the door, locked it, and sat there, hands trembling against the steering wheel. For a long time, I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared into the black woods, waiting for those glistening eyes to reappear. They never did. The official report blamed it on a bear. Aggressive wildlife encounter, they called it. I didn't argue. What else could I say? That I saw something impossible? Something wrong? They'd have laughed me right out of the Park Service. But I know what I saw. I still patrol Pine Hollow sometimes. I don't know why. Maybe I'm hoping to convince myself it was all in my head. But every time I walk those trails, I feel it watching me, waiting. Sometimes late at night, I hear that sound again. That rattling, broken breath, drifting in on the wind. The wilderness has rules. You respect the land, and it respects you. But whatever's out there in Pine Hollow, it doesn't play by the rules. And I don't think it ever will. My name is Diego Alvarez. I was a park ranger for over 15 years. And for most of that time, I believed I had seen it all. Poachers, rogue predators, lost hikers, until the incident that stole my brother from me. I still remember the chilling day it began, the one that would mark me forever. It happened in the deep forest just beyond the outskirts of Santa Clara, a small, quiet Spanish town nestled near ancient woods untouched for centuries. The locals spoke of the Tiniebla Bestia, the shadowed beast. They claimed it was no ordinary predator, but a spirit of the forest, something far older and far darker than we could imagine. Like most, I dismissed it as folklore. I had to stop believing in legends to do my job, until I learned some of them are all too real. It was early October when the strangeness began. That morning, the air was unusually thick, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Dew clung to every leaf, and a strange silence hung over the land. I found unusual tracks near the riverbank, massive, spade-like prints that seemed to shift shape slightly with each impression. They looked fluid, as though whatever left them didn't follow the rules of nature. But what troubled me most was the disappearance of my younger brother, Javier. He had been visiting from Madrid, eager to hike the trails I patrolled every day. Just a quick walk into the woods, hermano, he'd told me, grabbing his pack and heading off before I could protest. I didn't think much of it at first. Javier was stubborn, independent, and used to wilderness adventures. But by sunset, when he hadn't returned, a sinking dread settled in my stomach. I grabbed my gear, a lantern, my rifle, and my old compass, and set out into the forest to look for him. The deeper I went, the more unnatural the forest felt. The quiet grew oppressive. No birds, no insects, Nothing but the crunch of my boots against dead leaves. It was as though the woods were waiting for something, or someone. Then I found them. More tracks, leading straight into the dense, shadowed heart of the forest. They were deeper this time, almost as if whatever left them had been carrying something heavy, something human-sized. The tracks led me to an area the locals always avoided, a hollow where the trees grew twisted, their trunks blackened and gnarled like ancient sentinels. The air was cold here, unnaturally so, and a thin mist curled around the ground like grasping hands. My lantern flickered as if it, too, sensed the wrongness of this place. And then I heard it, the low, guttural growl that seemed to rumble from everywhere at once, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. I spun, rifle raised, scanning the trees. That's when I saw it. The shadowed beast stepped into view, emerging from the darkness like a nightmare given flesh. Its form defied logic. A lean, hulking body with joints that bent the wrong way, its skin shifting between fur and something slick like scales. Its eyes burned like embers in the dark, black pits glowing faintly red, filled with something that watched, that understood. Clutched in one of its twisted limbs was Javier's torn backpack. I froze. My body screamed to run, but my heart knew I couldn't leave without my brother. Javier! I shouted into the silence, my voice cracking. The beast tilted its head, its gaze locking onto me. It dropped the pack and stepped closer, moving with an unnatural, fluid grace. For a moment, it felt like the forest itself leaned toward me, every tree holding its breath. I fired a warning shot into the air, the sound ripping through the stillness. The beast recoiled slightly, letting out a sound I can only describe as a mixture of a growl and a low, metallic whine that made my teeth ache. Then, in one impossible motion, it turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving behind the backpack. I stumbled toward it, my hands shaking as I grabbed Javier's pack. Inside, there were claw marks across his maps, his canteen crushed as though it had been gripped by a vice. And at the bottom of the bag was his notebook, the last few pages smeared with dirt and blood. Scrawled across them were hastily written words. I saw it. It sees me too. It's everywhere, the forest itself. Diego, don't come. The rest was illegible. The next 2 days were a blur of desperate searching. I enlisted other rangers, local volunteers, and even the Guardia Civil. We combed the woods tirelessly, but each time I returned to the twisted hollow, something pushed us away. Lost compasses, strange gusts of wind, radios that cut out with bursts of static. It wasn't until the third night that I found him. Alone this time, I ventured back to the hollow, armed only with my rifle and a flare gun. The air was colder than before, and my breath misted as though I stood in the depths of winter. I found Javier lying at the base of one of those twisted trees. He was alive, but unconscious, his skin pale and his breathing shallow. The shadowed beast loomed nearby, half hidden among the trees, watching us with those ember-like eyes. I didn't fire this time. I couldn't. Somehow, I knew the creature wasn't hunting us. It was protecting something. I grabbed Javier, hoisting him over my shoulder, and backed away slowly. The beast didn't move, but I felt its eyes on me the whole time, as though it was warning me. By the time I reached safety, Javier was awake but disoriented. He wouldn't speak of what he'd seen, only muttering, "It's part of the forest, don't disturb it." The authorities ruled the incident a case of severe exposure and exhaustion, but I knew better. I'd seen what lurked in those woods. Something ancient, something that didn't belong to our world, but had claimed a place within it. Javier recovered, but he was never the same. He stopped visiting the forests and moved back to Madrid, where the shadows couldn't reach him. As for me, I stayed. I had sworn to protect these lands, and that meant protecting its secrets too. I still patrol near the hollow, though I never step inside. Occasionally, I hear that metallic whine carried on the wind or spot the shifting prints near the riverbank. The shadowed beast is still out there, watching, waiting. But I've learned to live with it. Some things in the wild are not meant to be understood. Some things simply are. And as long as I respect its territory, it leaves me, and those I care for in peace. But if you ever find yourself walking the outskirts of Santa Clara and the forest grows silent around you, heed my warning. Turn back. Some shadows are not meant to be disturbed. My name is Jack Marlowe, and for over 15 years, I was a ranger in Blackstone National Park, a place of towering cliffs, deep, whispering forests, and legends older than the trees themselves. The locals spoke of the Shadow Hound, a creature that hunted at night, emerging only for those who dared disturb its ancient domain. I never paid the stories much mind, chalking them up to folklore meant to keep folks out of trouble. That is, until one particular night when I learned that some legends are far more than just stories. It started on a cold October evening. The air had that crisp, electric stillness that comes just before a storm. I was scheduled for the late shift with Tom Cartwright, a new recruit. Tom was young, sharp-tongued, and eager, traits that made him useful during daylight hours, but less so when the woods fell into darkness. That night, a group of 6 campers had set up deep in the restricted zone of the park, well beyond the marked trails. Idiots, I muttered, strapping my flashlight to my belt. They don't listen, do they? Tom Ever the Optimist grinned. They probably think it's just a story, Jack. How dangerous can a shadow be? I didn't bother answering. I didn't like how quiet it was outside. Even the crickets seemed to know better than to chirp. We set out just before midnight, the beams of our flashlights cutting through the fog that clung to the earth like a shroud. The hike to the camper's site was grueling. Every twig snap felt louder, every gust of wind colder. By the time we reached the clearing, my gut was a knot of unease. The campsite was empty. Where the hell are they? Tom murmured. The tents were there. 3 of them, collapsed, torn, and partially buried under leaves as if someone had tried to cover them hastily. The campfire still smoldered, and the smell of burnt wood mingled with something fouler. I knelt by the nearest tent, feeling a deep chill run up my spine. The ground around the site was riddled with footprints, human at first glance. But mixed in with them were tracks I couldn't explain. They were massive, canine in shape, but the claws were too long, dragging like talons. Whatever made those prints had circled the camp again and again. Jack! Tom's voice cracked. He was standing near the tree lean, his flashlight trembling in his hand. I followed his gaze. Just beyond the clearing, where our beams barely reached, stood a shape. At first, it was little more than a shadow. A trick of the light, I thought. But then it moved. Eyes. 2 pale, glowing eyes stared back at us, cold and white like mist rolling off a tombstone. They didn't blink. The shadow itself seemed to pulse, its edges shifting as though the darkness around it was alive. Is that an animal? Tom whispered. The thing tilted its head, as if it understood him. Then it stepped forward. The flashlight beams hit it fully, and my stomach dropped. It was massive, its body a black, so deep it seemed to absorb the light. Its fur, or what looked like fur, rippled unnaturally, as if made of smoke. The head resembled a wolf's, but stretched and twisted into something wrong. Its teeth gleamed wetly as it growled, a sound so low it rattled my bones. Back to the station, I barked, "Now!" Tom didn't need telling twice. We ran, flashlights bobbing wildly, our boots pounding against the earth. Behind us, the creature's growl turned into something far worse, a laugh. It was guttural, distorted, echoing from everywhere at once. We reached the old ranger cabin 2 miles up the trail, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind us. The cabin was one of the park's oldest structures, abandoned decades ago, except for emergencies like this. The walls were thick, but not thick enough to silence the sound of snapping branches outside. They're gone, aren't they? Tom whispered, slumping to the floor. The campers. It got them. I didn't answer. I was too focused on the shadow moving past the window. The creature wasn't trying to break in. Not yet. Instead, it circled us, its glowing eyes watching from the darkness. A slow, deliberate scraping sound began at the walls, like claws being dragged against wood. It knows we're here, I said. We have to make it leave. How? Tom's voice was raw with panic. It's a monster. What do we do? Shoot it. I shook my head. I'd seen what guns did to normal predators. This wasn't something you could kill. I thought of the old legends, the ones I'd ignored for years. The shadow hound wasn't a beast. It was something older than the forest itself, a guardian, maybe, and the legend said it could only be appeased. I tore through the old supply crates in the cabin, searching for anything that might help. At the bottom of a rusted metal box, I found it, a bundle of blackened, ancient charcoal. An old ranger's logbook had once mentioned a ritual, tamed fire, ash, and a mark of surrender. Tom grabbed the coal from the fireplace. I ordered, dumping the charcoal onto the floor. Trust me. What are we doing? Old stories say fire keeps it at bay. But we need more than just light. We need a mark. We lit the charcoal and let it smolder, the smoke curling in the still air. I dipped my hand into the ash, the grit biting into my skin. Slowly, I smeared a black mark across the floorboards, a handprint of soot. I gestured for Tom to do the same. Outside, the growl became a snarl, furious and violent. Something heavy slammed into the cabin, shaking the walls. It's not leaving, Tom shouted. Keep quiet, I hissed. It reacts to noise and movement. The door began to splinter. I could see the wood darkening, rotting where its claws touched. Just as the door gave way, we pressed our ash-covered palms to the ground. The cabin plunged into silence. The creature froze in the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on us. And for a moment, I thought we were dead. Then, slowly, the shadows began to peel away from its body. The cabin grew brighter, the darkness receding as if being pulled back into the forest. The shadow hound turned without a sound and disappeared, melting into the night. We sat there until morning, too afraid to move, the ash handprints still marking the floor around us. When dawn broke, we finally stepped outside. The forest was still, quiet, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and smoke. The campsite, the footprints, even the broken door, they were gone, as though the creature had wiped all trace of itself away. We never found the campers. The official report blamed a bear attack, and I didn't argue. Tom never returned to Blackstone after that night, and I don't blame him. As for me, I stayed. But every night, I keep my routes close to the lighted trails, and I always carry a small bag of charcoal in my pack. Because I know the truth now. The shadow hound is still out there, and it's waiting for anyone foolish enough to disturb its domain again. My name is Logan Thompson, and for 10 years, I patrolled the depths of Blakemore Reserve. If you've ever heard of the place, then you've probably come across the stories, rumors really, of shadowy figures moving through the fog, of voices whispering in the dark. As rangers, we heard those tales constantly from spooked hikers and campers. Most of us dismissed them as tricks of the imagination. At least I did, until that one night. It was a cold, gray October evening when the call came through. A group of 3 hikers was reported missing. They were due back by sunset, and as the hours dragged on, their families grew frantic. Missing hikers were rare, but not unheard of in Blakemore. The dense forest and constant mist could disorient even experienced outdoorsmen. I figured this would be another long night of stomping through the underbrush, only to find them huddled together by a dead campfire. I grabbed my gear, my flashlight, a radio, a heavy rain jacket, and my trusty knife, and set off into the forest. The trees of Blakemore were ancient, their twisted trunks looming like sentinels. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the mist began to settle. It wasn't long before the world narrowed to a cone of light from my flashlight. Everything else swallowed in a damp, cloying darkness. By the time I reached the area where the hikers were last seen, my radio had started acting up. Static crackled and popped every time I tried to check in. Base, this is Thompson. I'm at Trailhead 9. No sign yet. Over. Only static answered. I pushed on, following faint tracks in the muddy ground. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the distant rustle of leaves. That unnatural silence crawled under my skin, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I rounded a bend in the trail, my flashlight flickered over something half buried in the leaves, a backpack. Its straps were torn, as if someone had pulled it off with force. Damn, I muttered, crouching to examine it. That's when I heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, like a whisper on the wind. Turn back. I shot to my feet, flashlight spinning wildly through the trees. Hello, I called. Is anyone out here? The forest swallowed my voice. I told myself it was nothing. Wind through the branches, maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Then up ahead, my light caught something carved into an old oak tree. Strange symbols, deep grooves that didn't look natural. They were jagged, curling into shapes I didn't recognize, as though etched by hands that didn't know how to hold tools. The whispering came again, louder this time, and from everywhere. It was as though the mist itself was speaking. You shouldn't be here. My chest tightened. I turned, ready to get the hell out of there, but froze when I saw it. At the edge of my flashlight's beam stood a figure, tall, impossibly tall, with arms that hung almost to the ground. Its form was draped in shadow, but its eyes were like burning embers, 2 points of red fire locked on me. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound, but the whispering grew louder, echoing in my skull. I don't know how long I stood there, rooted to the spot, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, as if the forest itself exhaled, the figure took a step forward. Its movements were wrong, too smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. Stay back, I shouted, my voice breaking. The thing tilted its head, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. And then I heard it, a shriek, distant at first but growing closer. It was like the sound of wind howling through a broken window, but layered with something else, something alive. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. The forest seemed to close in around me, the mist thicker than before, until I burst into a clearing and saw it, an old, abandoned ranger station. I sprinted for the door, slamming it shut behind me. The walls rattled as the thing outside circled the building, its whispers rising to a fever pitch. I pressed my back against the door, clutching my knife, praying the wood would hold. Outside, the red glow of those eyes moved past the windows, and for a moment, I swore I heard my own voice whispering back at me. You shouldn't be here. It felt like hours before the whispers faded and the red glow disappeared into the mist. I stayed in that building until the first light of dawn bled through the trees, clutching my knife in numb fingers. When I finally stepped outside, the forest was silent again. Normal even. The mist had lifted and the air was clear, but I didn't feel relief. Something in Blakemore had watched me that night. Something had let me go. The hikers were never found. Their families had no answers, and neither did I. I filed my report. Inconclusive. I called it, but I knew better. After that night, I stopped patrolling the deeper parts of Blakemore. I stayed on the main trails, where the forest still felt like the forest. But every now and then, on foggy nights, I swear I still hear it. That faint, distorted whisper carried on the wind. You shouldn't be here. My name's Evan Delaney, and for close to 15 years, I serve as a ranger in the Dunn's Hollow State Park, a sprawling, rugged expanse of forest in southern Colorado. I always loved the land. Something about its ancient pines and quiet, winding trails felt untouched, timeless. But as much as I respected it, there's one thing I learned the hard way. Dunn's Hollow wasn't as empty as it seemed. This story happened in July of 2015, during the height of the summer season. The park was buzzing with hikers, campers, and families looking to escape the city heat. I was pulling double duty that week, short-staffed and exhausted, when a call came in late in the evening. A group of 4 campers, 2 adults, 2 teenagers, hadn't returned to the main campgrounds. Their family was panicking, and dusk was quickly falling. I grabbed my gear, flashlight, med kit, satellite radio, and my shotgun. Park protocol said it was overkill, but after years of strange animal sightings and sounds we couldn't explain, I never headed out after dark unarmed. The missing group had last checked in near Pinecrest Ridge, a remote area of the park surrounded by steep cliffs and dense underbrush. It wasn't a place you wanted to be at night. I arrived at the ridge just as the sun dipped below the tree line, bleeding orange across the horizon. The forest around me felt different. Heavy. I'd spent enough time in Dunn's Hollow to know when something was wrong. Birds that should have been calling had gone silent, and the usual hum of insects had vanished. All that was left was the whisper of wind through the pines and my boots crunching on dry leaves. As I pushed deeper into the woods, I caught sight of something glinting in the fading light. A backpack half buried beneath a bush. It belonged to one of the teenagers. Kneeling to check for clues, I heard it, a deep, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a hiss. My flashlight beam swung wildly, cutting through the shadows. I could have sworn I saw something move, a dark shape that slipped between the trees faster than any animal I'd ever seen. I kept going, my nerves buzzing like live wires. About half a mile further, I found them. The family was huddled together in a small clearing, crouched low beside a fire that had burned down to embers. Their faces were pale, eyes darting around the dark, as if expecting something to jump out at them. "Mister, help us!" the father cried when he saw me. He looked frantic, clutching a branch like it was a weapon. "What happened?" I asked, scanning the trees. "It's out there," the older teenager whispered. "It's been circling us for hours." Before I could ask what it was, I heard it again, that same low, vibrating growl, but this time it was closer. I swung my flashlight into the darkness and froze. Just beyond the tree line stood a creature that shouldn't have existed. It was tall, hunched, and wrong, like something half-formed between a man and a beast. Its limbs were too long, ending in clawed hands that scraped at the ground. The skin was pale and stretched tight, and its face, God, its face. There was no nose, just a wide, lipless mouth and 2 black eyes that reflected the light like mirrors. "Stay behind me," I barked, pumping the shotgun. The creature stepped forward, its body moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. It tilted its head, studying me, and then it screamed. It was a sound I'll never forget, like metal tearing, but layered with something alive, something intelligent. The teenagers covered their ears, the mother sobbed, and the fire hissed like it was choking. I fired a shot. The blast echoed through the clearing, and for a second, the thing staggered, its shoulder erupting in a spray of dark, inky blood. But it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a guttural shriek and charged. What followed was a blur. I fired again and again, backing up, trying to put distance between us. The creature was fast, too fast, and it swiped at me, claws catching my jacket and tearing through the fabric. The force knocked me off balance, and for a split second, I thought that was it. Then I heard the teenage boy yell, "The fire! It hates the fire!" In the chaos, I realized he was right. Every time the creature got close to the smoldering embers, it recoiled, that inhuman scream rising again. My mind was racing. Fire! Fire was the key. "Everyone, get to the fire!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. Get it going now? The father grabbed a handful of dry sticks and tossed them into the pit. I shot at the creature again, slowing it down just enough to buy time. The fire flared brighter, flames licking higher into the night air. The thing shrieked and lurched back, its dark, reflective eyes fixed on the light. I didn't stop to question it. Keep feeding the fire, I yelled, grabbing a half-burned log from the ground. I swung it like a club, embers scattering as it hit the creature square in the chest. It screamed louder than before, stumbling back into the darkness, its pale skin smoldering where the fire touched it. For what felt like hours, we stood there, feeding the flames, watching the tree lean. The creature stayed just beyond the light, circling, growling, its black eyes gleaming like oil. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The growling faded, replaced by the distant hum of crickets and the crackling of fire. We stayed in that clearing until dawn. I didn't sleep. I didn't dare. When the first light crept through the trees, I led the family back to the main campgrounds. They were shaken but alive, and I thank God for that. I reported the incident as an animal attack, though I knew damn well no animal in this world looked or moved like what I saw that night. The park officials investigated but found nothing. No tracks, no blood, nothing to prove what happened was real. But I know it was real. I saw it. I fought it. To this day, I avoid Pinecrest Ridge, especially at night. I tell hikers to stay on the marked trails, and when they ask why, I just say it's safer that way. There are things out there, things the forest keeps hidden in its darkest corners. If you're lucky, you'll never meet them. But if you do, remember this. Fire is your friend, and sometimes surviving the night is victory enough.